Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. intelligence officials, NATO security planners, and senior Western defense analysts had feared might come one day, but hoped would not arrive this abruptly. Not after months of strategic positioning, not after long diplomatic signaling, but suddenly, quietly, and with consequences that may redefine the course of this war. What happened did not unfold through a press conference. There was no dramatic announcement, no public ultimatum, no visible escalation on television screens. Instead, it began the way the most serious geopolitical shifts often do, with silence. A silence so unusual that it immediately triggered alarms inside intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic. Early indications appeared not in headlines, but in data. Communications patterns changed, diplomatic routines were disrupted. Schedules that had remained consistent for months were suddenly altered without explanation. And when analysts noticed that Kyiv's leadership had gone unusually quiet, they knew something significant was underway. This was not normal wartime silence. This was calculated. And intelligence professionals know the difference. Within hours, senior U.S. intelligence officials were convened for emergency briefings. What they were seeing did not suggest chaos or collapse. Quite the opposite. It suggested preparation, coordination, and a deliberate shift in posture that had not been shared publicly, not with the press, not with the public, and not even with some allied governments. At the center of this shift was President Volodymyr Zelensky. For more than 2 years, Zelensky's messaging had followed a consistent, almost predictable pattern. Defiance, resolve, absolute clarity on Ukraine's red lines, no concessions, no compromises, no ambiguity about territorial integrity. That consistency had been one of Ukraine's greatest strategic strengths, helping to anchor Western support and maintain unity among allies. And then, without warning, that pattern broke. Intelligence analysts began noticing what was missing. The regular cadence of statements slowed. Planned appearances were quietly postponed. Certain diplomatic engagements were rerouted through intermediaries rather than direct channels. Even Zelensky's inner circle appeared to be operating on partial information, with decision-making narrowed to a smaller, more controlled group. This was not hesitation, it was concentration. Behind the scenes, Ukrainian officials were engaging in private conversations that had not occurred at this scale in over a year. Conversations not about weapons deliveries or battlefield tactics, but about outcomes. End states. Scenarios that, until recently, had been considered politically untouchable. And that is when Washington's concern deepened. Because when a wartime leader begins exploring paths that were once off-limits, it changes how adversaries interpret intent. It changes assumptions. It changes risk calculations. And in this case, U.S. intelligence officials became increasingly concerned not about what Ukraine was doing, but about how Moscow might interpret it. Shortly after these signals were detected, the CIA moved. What followed was not a public warning, not a speech, not a press release. It was something far more serious. According to multiple sources familiar with the matter, CIA Director William Burns authorized an emergency communication to Moscow through intelligence channels that have remained open despite the collapse of normal diplomatic relations. These channels are rarely used, and when they are activated, it is never routine. Burns's message was described as direct, unambiguous, and urgent. The warning was not about negotiation. It was not about diplomacy. It was about restraint. U.S. intelligence assessments indicated a growing risk that the Kremlin could misread Ukraine's evolving posture as weakness. And history has shown that when Moscow perceives weakness, it does not de-escalate. It presses harder. It demands more. It escalates. Washington wanted to make one thing absolutely clear. Any attempt by Russia to exploit this moment militarily or strategically would trigger a response far more significant than anything seen in recent months. This was not deterrence by press conference, this was deterrence by private signal. And it carried weight. William Burns is not just any intelligence chief. He is one of the few American officials who has spent years dealing directly with Russian leadership. He understands Kremlin psychology. He understands how messages are interpreted inside Moscow. And most importantly, Vladimir Putin takes him seriously. When Burns speaks through these channels, it is understood that the message reflects consensus at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Almost immediately after the warning was delivered, U.S. intelligence agencies shifted posture. Surveillance assets were repositioned. Satellite coverage over key Russian military zones was intensified. Signals intelligence collection increased. Human intelligence networks were activated with renewed urgency. These are not symbolic gestures. These are measures taken when escalation is considered plausible. At the same time, the Pentagon quietly accelerated certain military preparations. Officials declined to offer details, but sources confirmed that air defense systems and rapid response logistics were prioritized. The concern was straightforward. If Moscow interpreted Ukraine's shift incorrectly, the response might come swiftly and violently. European capitals, meanwhile, were informed through secure channels, not all at once, not publicly, but deliberately. London, Berlin, Paris, Warsaw. The message from Washington was consistent. This was a moment of risk. Unity mattered. Any hesitation or public disagreement could be seized upon by Moscow as evidence of fragmentation. And fragmentation, intelligence officials warned, would be far more dangerous than disagreement behind closed doors. What makes this moment particularly volatile is the pressure Vladimir Putin is currently facing at home. Russian military commanders are under strain. The costs of the war have mounted far beyond early projections. Sanctions continue to bite. And public tolerance, while controlled, is not limitless. In such moments, leaders often look for opportunities to reassert strength. Intelligence analysts fear that Putin may see Ukraine's shift not as an opening for peace, but as confirmation that sustained pressure is working. That belief, if it takes hold, could lead to escalation rather than compromise. And that is precisely what the CIA's warning was designed to prevent. But here's the complication. Some analysts believe Zelensky's move was not a retreat, but a test. By signaling flexibility without formally conceding anything, Ukraine may be attempting to force Moscow to reveal its true intentions. If Russia responds with restraint, negotiations become possible. If Russia responds with aggression, Ukraine strengthens its case that peace is impossible under current conditions. It is a dangerous strategy, a calculated risk. And it places enormous pressure on Putin. If he escalates, he reinforces Western unity. If he restrains himself, he risks appearing weak to hardliners at home. Either choice carries consequences. This is the trap that intelligence officials believe may now be closing. As of tonight, the Kremlin has not issued a clear public response. Russian state media has adjusted its tone, amplifying narratives of Ukrainian fatigue while avoiding direct commitments. Military movements along several fronts have increased, modestly, not enough to signal full escalation, but enough to keep analysts watching closely. And that silence from Moscow is now the most unsettling signal of all. Because when Putin goes quiet, it usually means he is calculating. And what he decides in the coming hours may determine whether this moment becomes the beginning of a diplomatic breakthrough or the trigger for a far more dangerous phase of the war. The next 72 hours will be critical. And right now, every intelligence agency involved is watching the same thing, waiting for the next move. And what intelligence officials are watching most closely now is not what Moscow says, but what Moscow does. Because in this phase of the war, actions matter far more than statements. And the early indicators suggest that the Kremlin is weighing options that go well beyond routine responses. Over the past several hours, analysts have observed subtle but meaningful shifts across multiple domains at once. Russian military communications have shown changes in encryption patterns consistent with high-level coordination. Certain command structures that had remained relatively dormant have suddenly become active. Logistics hubs in occupied territories have increased throughput. None of this confirms a single outcome, but taken together, it suggests preparation rather than reaction. This is exactly the kind of moment intelligence agencies train for, moments where ambiguity itself becomes a weapon. Inside Washington, officials are acutely aware that this is not just about Ukraine's next move or Russia's next decision. It is about perception, about preventing miscalculation, about making sure that signals sent quietly are received clearly. That is why the CIA's warning was framed the way it was. According to officials familiar with the communication, Burns did not threaten, he did not posture, he did not outline red lines in dramatic language. Instead, he delivered something far more effective: clarity. He made it unmistakably clear that the United States was watching this moment closely, that it understood the risks, and that it would not allow Ukrainian flexibility to be exploited as an opportunity for coercion or expansion. In intelligence terms, this is called shaping the decision space. By narrowing the range of acceptable actions, Washington is attempting to reduce the likelihood of a catastrophic misread. But that effort has limits, because ultimately, the decision rests with one man, Vladimir Putin. And Putin is facing a convergence of pressures unlike anything earlier in this war. Militarily, the conflict has become a grinding test of endurance rather than a campaign of decisive breakthroughs. Politically, he must balance hardliners who demand escalation with elites who want sanctions relief. Strategically, he must decide whether prolonged war still serves Russia's long-term interests. Ukraine's shift has complicated that calculus. If Putin responds with escalation, he risks triggering exactly what he has sought to avoid: deeper Western involvement, stronger military aid to Ukraine, and renewed unity among NATO allies. If he responds with restraint, he risks appearing weak at home, undermining the narrative of control and inevitability that has sustained his rule. And so, he waits. This waiting period is not passive. Russian state media has begun laying groundwork, framing Ukraine's posture as evidence of exhaustion while emphasizing Russia's supposed strategic patience. Diplomats have been unusually quiet. Public messaging has slowed. These are classic signs of a leadership preparing its audience for a shift, though the direction of that shift remains unclear. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the atmosphere is tense but controlled. Zelensky addressed his inner circle with language that was firm, measured, and carefully calibrated. According to sources, he emphasized that flexibility does not mean surrender and dialogue does not mean capitulation. He reiterated that Ukraine's core security interests remain non-negotiable, even as diplomatic paths are explored. This balance is extraordinarily difficult to maintain. Ukrainian society is exhausted. The human cost of the war has been immense. Families have sacrificed, cities have endured. And while public support for resistance remains strong, the desire for an end to the conflict is growing. Zelensky must speak to that exhaustion without undermining the resolve that has kept the country fighting. At the same time, he must reassure Western allies that Ukraine is not wavering, that it remains a reliable partner, and that any diplomatic engagement will not come at the expense of long-term stability. That is why U.S. officials have been so careful in their own messaging. Publicly, they continue to affirm unwavering support for Ukraine. Privately, they are working overtime to ensure alignment, prevent fractures, and maintain pressure where it matters most. The alliance response over the past day reflects that urgency. Intelligence sharing among the Five Eyes has intensified. NATO planners have reviewed contingency scenarios that had not been actively discussed in months. Defense ministries have quietly assessed readiness levels. None of these steps indicate an immediate crisis, but they do indicate preparation for one. And preparation, in this context, is deterrence. The goal is not to provoke. It is not to escalate. It is to make clear that any attempt to seize advantage from ambiguity will be met with cohesion, not confusion. History looms heavily over this moment. Time and again, wars have escalated not because leaders wanted them to, but because they misinterpreted signals, misjudged resolve, or believed that restraint signaled weakness. U.S. intelligence officials are acutely aware of this pattern. It is one they are trying desperately to break. That is why this moment feels different. For the first time in months, the usual scripts are not being followed. Ukraine has altered its tone. The United States has intervened quietly but forcefully. Europe is watching closely, conscious that unity is both its strength and its vulnerability. And Russia is calculating. The coming days will reveal whether this recalibration leads toward de-escalation or confrontation. If Putin chooses restraint, even temporarily, it could open space for genuine diplomacy. If he chooses pressure, the war could enter a more dangerous phase, one defined by rapid moves and narrow margins for error. Intelligence officials caution against optimism. They know that moments like this often feel calm right before they become chaotic. The absence of immediate escalation does not guarantee stability. It simply means decisions are still being made. And those decisions will be shaped by how each side interprets the other's resolve. Tonight, the CIA's warning stands as a marker, a signal sent not for public consumption, but for a single audience. A reminder that the United States is not disengaged, not distracted, and not willing to allow this moment to spiral out of control. Whether that reminder is enough remains to be seen. For now, the world waits. Because somewhere in Moscow, a calculation is being finalized. And when it is, the consequences will ripple far beyond the battlefield. This story is still unfolding, and the next move may already be in motion.